My name is Malik. I am a web developer, kind of learning the back end and React as a framework right now. And today I'm going to be talking about Truthy and Falsy in JavaScript. Can everybody see those slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Awesome. Just want to make sure. So Truthy and Falsy exist outside of JavaScript, but I'm going to go over how we evaluate Booleans with JavaScript itself. And to start out, just like any other language, JavaScript has certain data types, those of which are enumerated by 8 different kinds. So we have 7 primitives as well as an object. And one of those primitives is called a Boolean, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with. It's a logical type, and it specifically holds one of 2 different values, either true or false. And in contrast to the topic of this discussion itself, true and false are not necessarily equivalent to truthy and falsy. And the Boolean primitive is not exactly the same thing as a Boolean object, which I won't be going over in detail here. With that, I'm going to move over to VS Code, a code editor, to show you a quick example of how Boolean primitives work with truthy and falsy. So right here, I have a variable named Boolean, which is storing the value of true. And so with this variable, I'm passing it into a conditional test. And in this if statement, we have 2 parentheses which hold the variable. And then what we're doing here is using JavaScript to say, if this value is truthy, then print out this string or this segment of characters and tell us that it's truthy. And if not, then we want it to print out this other string and let us know that it must be falsy. All right, so that's pretty simple. So let's move on to a little bit more depth about how truthy and falsy operate. So we can use it with the Boolean primitive, or we can use it with any of the other 7 data types in JavaScript. It doesn't have to just be that one primitive. And JavaScript itself has rules to govern all of these different concepts. And we use truthy and falsy for purposes of debugging our programs or our websites, for certain data comparisons that we need to take care of, either on the front end or back end of development, and conditional rendering such that we can decide if a certain piece of functionality pops up and displays at a certain time, dependent on how the user operates with the application or website. And to break truthy and falsy down a little bit more, I'll start with the falsy side of things. So anything that's falsy is going to be a 0 value number. It's going to be a string value. It will be a Boolean false keyword, a primitive type undefined, a primitive type of null, or something defined as not a number. And going back to the examples, what I've done here is defined all the value types that I just mentioned as variables where we have different variations of each value, right? So we have 0 value types, which are 0, -0, a big integer 0. We have all different types of strings defined in JavaScript. We have the Boolean false value, and then undefined, null, and not a number. And I've passed all those into this test array, where right below it, I'm iterating through each of those items in the array, and we're testing it with a similar conditional statement like I had in the first example, where we say for any of those variables, if they're truthy, then let us know they're truthy by printing out this string of characters that says truthy, right? And if they're falsy, then we want to print out not a string, but the actual value of the variable itself, which we can see right here. And the other side of that is truthy evaluations, which is at its core anything which is not falsy. All right, so that's non-zero numbers. It's strings containing a minimum of one character. Alternatively, the true keyword, empty or populated arrays, empty or populated objects, empty or initialized functions. And one last example here is much like the prior example, but we will be defining variables with positive and negative numbers, big integer and infinity, any type of string, the true keyword, and then we have empty or filled arrays, objects, and also functions, which are all then passed into the truthy test array, which is here. And everything is iterated through with this function. And we find that all these values are truthy by using this conditional statement. Whereas if they were falsy, we would do just like in the last example, and we would print out the value of the variables themselves. Right, so there's a lot more to learning about truthy and falsy, as well as things that are closely related to those concepts. The aforementioned Boolean objects would be the first thing I would mention, but we also have loose equality comparisons in JavaScript and strict equality comparisons. We have explicit Boolean conversion, and then we have the general idea of coercion in JavaScript. And here are some of the sources I have for the information I shared with you. And here are a few different links that I have where you can contact me.